All right, good evening, everybody. Thanks so much for coming out. My name is Stuart Rockoff. I'm the Executive Director of the Mississippi Humanities Council. Since 1972, the Humanities Council has sponsored a wide range of programs designed to promote understanding of our history, interpret our own experience, foster critical thinking, strengthen our sense of community, and empower Mississippi's people with a vision for the future. This year, we are sponsoring a series of programs marking the centennial of the Pulitzer Prizes. In fact, tonight is the second of a three-part series of programs in which we are partnering with the Overby Center here at the University of Mississippi. Our first program was back in January on the Mississippi Gulf Coast, and our final program will take place April 8th in Jackson at Millsaps College. And each of these programs has explored the sort of legacy of Mississippi's journalistic Pulitzer winners. We're also sponsoring a series of events and programs related to the literary Pulitzers here in our state, including there were some special programs at the recent Oxford Conference for the book. We still have some more upcoming. Please visit our website at mshumanities.org or follow us on Facebook to learn more about them. This program is part of the Pulitzer Prize Centennial Campfires Initiative, which is a joint venture of the Pulitzer Prizes Board and the Federation of State Humanities Councils. This initiative seeks to illuminate the impact of journalism and the humanities on American life today, to imagine their future, and to inspire new generations to then consider the values represented by Pulitzer Prize-winning work. For their generous support of this initiative, I'd like to thank the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation, the Pulitzer Prize Board, and Columbia University. When we at the Council first heard about this sort of Pulitzer Centennial, my very first idea was to contact Curtis Wilkie. And it just so happened that I was in Natchez not long after, as was he, and I got seated next to him at a dinner, and I buttonholed him, and he quickly agreed to be our partner. I'm very grateful for that. And I have had the great pleasure of working with Curtis and with Charles Overby in putting this series together. And I think it's really been a wonderful example of the sort of collaboration that is central to the work of the Mississippi Humanities Council. So now I think technically I'm supposed to introduce Curtis Wilkie, but in this room, on this campus, and frankly in this state, he really needs no introduction. So let me get out of the way and have Curtis Wilkie, who is the inaugural Overby Fellow and the Kelly G. Cook Chair of Journalism here at Ole Miss, introduce our panel and begin our program. Curtis.
Thank you, Stuart. And thank you all for coming. Welcome to the campus. We've got a good program today with some interesting people. We are short one person, I'll say at the outset. Jan Witt, who is professor at the University of Colorado and has written a book on Hazel Brannon Smith, was going to be here. She ran afoul of Frontier Airlines. So yet another wonderful example of American commercial airlines. She drove from Boulder to Denver yesterday to get on her Frontier flight. She was holding a ticket and they no longer had a seat for her. They informed her that they overbook all their flights and they have no cooperative arrangement with any other airline. They said they could get her to Memphis by March 27th. She went to United, and they said their one flight to Memphis was booked, but they could get her there day after tomorrow. So Jan sadly sends regret. She would have loved to have been here, and we would have loved to have had her here. She was going to talk about one of the Mississippi editors who are the subject today, that is Hazel Brannon Smith, and I promised Jan that Hazel will not be neglected. Hodding knew Hazel well. I knew Hazel slightly, and I also picked my friend Al Paval's brain yesterday. Al grew up in Lexington and told me a couple of old Hazel Brannon Smith stories. So we'll talk about Hazel, but we'll also talk about two other courageous Mississippi editors who won Pulitzer Prizes for their voice against discrimination. would be Hodding Carter II at the Greenville, at the Delta Democrat Times in Greenville. Hodding Carter won it, I think so many of us assume, for his voice against discrimination against during the civil rights era. He actually won the Pulitzer Prize for editorials as early as 1946 about the discrimination toward Japanese Americans, both during and after, immediately after World War II. And of course, he continued to be a voice of sanity in Mississippi in the 60s. And speaking of voices of sanity in Mississippi in the 60s, the other editor was Ira Harkey at the Chronicle in Pascagoula. Ira Harkey was a courageous voice. He won the Pulitzer for his, basically his position involving the Ole Miss crisis and Governor Barnett's mishandling of it. As we go along, I'll give you some idea of what these editors had to say. It was, they didn't mince any words about their opposition to what was going on in Mississippi during this particular time. But here today to talk about them, we have sons of two of the editors. We have my old friend Hodding Carter III, who is no stranger to Mississippi nor the Ole Miss campus. Hodding followed his dad as an editor at the Delta Democrat Times, later became Assistant Secretary of State during the Jimmy Carter administration. He was spokesman for Secretary of State at the time, and went on. He's taught at the University of Maryland, University of North Carolina. He's run a big foundation. He's kind of covered the waterfront. And Hodding, we're glad to have you back. And to his left is Judge Dale Harkey from Pascagoula, son of Ira Harkey. And having said that, I have to also recognize we have Ira Harkey III here, and welcome all the Harkey family and friends from Pascagoula coming here. Judge Harkey is also got a distinguished background like Hodding Carter III. He was at one time, when I first met you, when your dad was here and wanted to put the Silver M in 2002, you were district attorney, I believe, weren't you, in Jackson County? Yes, and he's now gone on, he is a circuit judge in Jackson County. So, and Ole Miss law grad, I add, so we're glad to have you back on campus too. So with that kind of set up, I think the first question I'd ask both of you, and maybe Hodding, you can talk, and Dale, you were a bit younger during this period, but how much aware were you of the threat of violence that might have been directed to your family as a result of the positions, editorial positions your father took?
I hate to do this. I don't really. The thing is that his editorials were not about the Japanese Americans. One was about the Japanese Americans. The other 11 were about matters of race in Mississippi.
Thank you.
It's a common misapprehension because the one they cited was called Go for Broke, which was the motto of the 442nd Regiment, the most decorated infantry outfit in World War II, Japanese Americans. And so the end of that editorial said, they went for broke for us. It's time for us to undo what we did to their families and to them in interning them in the right, which made him one of the great heroes of the Japanese community everywhere else. But the rest of them were calling various people, and I'll go to why he won the editorial. First, Dad did not apply for that prize. He didn't even know it had been submitted. It was for editorials he wrote when he shouldn't have been writing them, when he was in the long process of getting out of the Army after VE Day and before VJ Day, and when he was trying to decide whether he was going blind or not. But what he was doing was going crazy, because he discovered that while a lot of people had been out fighting for something we call democracy, a lot of folks back home really weren't in favor of it. and were making it very clear about what they were saying and doing. So he took on Jim Eastland and carved a piece out of him when Eastland suggested blacks were cowards. He took another piece out of Bill Beaufort. I mean, he was talking a lot about race in this country as determined by what whites were saying and doing. Let me be very clear, just so we all can start right off with this one. I don't think on the day he died, my dad was what you call, quote, an integrationist. What he was a man who believed in equity within whatever form, and he hated beyond belief the oppression of individuals by a system or by other individuals. That one would drive him crazy. But his partner submitted the editorials at the end of 1945. The award comes down in 46. I think that was the first time Dad almost had a heart attack because he didn't know anything was in. It was a wonderful thing to find out. One other thing about Dad, just to be also clear, everybody who was going to be on this panel was and is, alive or dead, an evolutionist. My father was the grandson and son of Ku Klux Klan folk. He himself grew up as a segregationist. I had no doubts about it at all. When brought to Greenville in 1936, he was quite clear that while fairness and decency, you don't shoot people in the back and all of that, that you had to maintain segregation. He was brought there by William Alexander Percy, a name that may be familiar to some of you. And as the Percys are happy to say these days, if Will had lived past 1941, they probably wouldn't have remained friends because Dad was changing all the time. And when it came to race, Will Percy never did. But the other thing to say about Dad is he believed that local newspapers had an obligation to speak directly to and from community. He did not consider himself to be a guy on top of a post telling all those little animals down below what to think. He participated. He was a consummate believer in the small town newspaper credo of the town's success is your success and vice versa. And he promoted it forever.
Dale?
My recollection of, perhaps the threats and the fears and the atmosphere, obviously, I have no knowledge of. I have to admit, I was 10 years old in 1962 when the Meredith incident here, the admission of Meredith swept the state in such, left in such hysterical atmosphere in the state. But in contrast, from my knowledge of Dad and talking to him over the years and in later years especially, I think when he arrived on the scene here in Mississippi, 1949, born in New Orleans, but he always referred to himself with a little exaggeration because he was not born in Mississippi, but he considered himself to be an 8th generation Mississippian, going back that far on both sides of his family, from Harpersville in Scott County, where his grandfather left in the early teens. When he was 18 years old, he said riding a mule, ended up in New Orleans and developed a successful business and was a very successful businessman in New Orleans. When Daddy, after the war, educated at Tulane and served in the U.S. Navy, saw action at Okinawa and Pacific. And first thing, he wanted to buy a small daily newspaper. And he searched the country and traveled far and wide. Found one in Pascagoula and was able to purchase it with the help of my grandfather in 1949. I think, truly, when he arrived on the scene, his opinions, his outlook, his philosophy, he was wholly foreign. In 1950, he was invited to speak to the Mississippi Press Association in Biloxi, a year after he had purchased the Chronicle Star, at the ripe age of 31. And at 32 years of age, I don't know who assigned him, if anyone did, what idiot assigned him the topic, or if he chose it himself. The topic was how to handle the Negro in the news. And at the ripe age of 32, he told these seasoned, grizzled veterans, I'm sure, of the Mississippi Press Association, exactly how he intended and did handle the Negro in the news. And he quite emphatically stated he was handling the same way He would handle the white news. He would call them Mr. and Mrs. He would eliminate the Negro tag. Those things were just, undignified and demeaned, a whole segment of the population that had been put down for so long. Daddy's, religious and other, his idea of fairness and equality, demanded it, and he intended to do that from the start. Yeah. And it was, unlike, others, I'm not saying, I don't know if he was an integrationist, if you saw that far down the road, but he sure took up the mantle of it as soon as a Brown versus Board of Education decision came down in '54.
You asked a question about guns, however, and about violence and the rest of it. Unlike you, I grew up in a house where there were guns everywhere. From the first memory that I have in '39 and '40, before we go off to the war, his dad has guns everywhere. When we come back, by that time, just to be blunt about it, he is in 1945 the returning boy from the war who has already been anointed by Jews, communists, blacks, as a winner of the Pulitzer Prize. You know what, that really made you a very popular guy in Mississippi at the time, okay? Yeah, Dad, whether he may or may not have been what people like to call liberal, he was a tough sucker. And he basically let it be known that if somebody wanted to come for him, they could come and he'd be there. And he had guns in every room. I grew up in which there were guns in the car, there were guns at the newspaper, there were guns all over the house. And when I came back from the Marines in 1959, Dad having by that time becoming the chief whipping boy in Mississippi for the Citizens Council, I carried a gun for 5 years in my pocket and kept it in the desk. And a lot of that was histrionics. I mean, and macho ex-Marine stuff, except, of course, that walking up and down the roads of the Delta was old DeLay Beckwith, who loved to ask people who work with him, tell me again, where does Hodding Carter like to spend his time? Which was a somewhat unnerving thing to know.
DeLay Beckwith?
DeLay Beckwith. In any case, that was a natural thing for me. But I want to repeat, being brave and refusing to accept the legitimacy of mistreatment did not make him a favorite of the Upper West Side of New York. Oh. He was not a liberal. He was not a guy who liked civil rights laws for a long time. And he simply couldn't stand one other thing worse than that. And that was the abuse of the individuals. And he was quite passionate on that subject. And my dad, passionate, would say almost anything that came to his head. Yeah. Which
they shared that comment.
Yes, right.
I believe
well, that was the thing I most admired
that characteristic.
From afar about Ira. He would say, by God, wonderful stuff.
Just he would call it like he
did.
Ira Harkey said of our Congressman John Rankin that he's, quote, perhaps the vilest hater ever to disgrace the halls of Congress. So take that, John Rankin. During the Ole Miss crisis in '62, when both of these men distinguished themselves, Hodding Carter wrote that Ross Barnett had led the state on a course toward a, quote, a jungle world of anarchy, and Ira Harkey predicted that that in a madhouse den, Mississippi waits. God help Mississippi. And after the riot here, Ira Harkey wrote that Barnett led his state down a path that inevitably led to riot, destruction, and death. Hodding, I remember the story that during the Ole Miss crisis, your dad felt so embattled that he called his sons home to defend the big house.
Well, now let me get the story right. As long as we're going to tell these long in the tooth stories. I'd been running the paper since the beginning of '62. Dad's health was bad the last 10 years of his life, and he went down to New Orleans to be a writer in residence at Tulane, which was a great treat for a lot of kids who couldn't believe him. But in any case, we were carrying on a number of editorials. I always thought I ought to have gotten the Pulitzer instead of Ira. But in any case, on the day On the day
He told you what he thought about that.
Yeah, of course. On the day of the rioting itself, my last editorial had been that the governor was, in fact, guilty of sedition, and he had to be thrown into a federal pen as fast as they could get him there. And that day we lost 10% of the circulation we hadn't already lost 10% of the day before, when we had written that, of course, that the governor was intent upon destroying the public universities of the state and the state itself. But it was the sedition line that I liked best.
I'm not sure where.
Seditious psychopath.
Yes, well, there was that too.
I don't know where that pugnaciousness came from with these gentlemen. With your dad, my dad.
I know, it's amazing.
Oh, they're both from Louisiana, maybe.
Both from Louisiana.
That has a lot to do with it.
Affiliated with Tulane at one time or another, graduated or taught, and Dad likened Barnett to a reptile. I think in one of his a reptilian look that he had in one of his editorials. I don't know where that came from, but they meant it, you know. And Dad, I know Dad. If he never told me, but I know he really had wished a resolution of the state legislature had been passed calling him a liar.
Yes, that's right. After Dad wrote a piece in Look magazine about the Citizens Council in 1955, which had the extremely restrained title on it, A New Wave of Terror Threatens the South, the legislature, by a vote of 115 to something, or 89 to 15.
89-19, I have it here.
89-19, resolved that he was a liar. You know, and so he wrote a front page editorial and said by a vote of 1-0, he would suggest that those liars, and he made some play off the name of one of them, whose name was Eck Wickham.
Representative Eck Wyndham.
Wyndham.
A political loon whose name is fittingly made up of the words wind and ham.
Right.
And
if they expect me to back down, they can go to hell and wait and not count on coming back. That was his last line.
That's right.
Yeah, he.
Good paraphrase.
That was as good as I'm gonna get.
Now,
Daddy regretted not having it set up for him, I'm sure.
I'd also point out that before Hodding Carter came to Greenville, he had a paper in Hammond, Louisiana, and was an arch enemy of Huey Long.
And was violent as only a 25-year-old can be. He started a little daily newspaper in Hammond, Louisiana. He started it within 2 weeks of the collapse of the banks of the United States of America. And he maintained it for about 2 years, which was about all that anybody standing against Huey Long north of New Orleans was going to last with the newspaper. And if as best anybody can make out, Daddy's one objective in life was to be the agent of Huey Long's destruction. I mean, and speaking of going to hell and holding your breath, I mean, it wasn't going to happen in Louisiana. But the first documentary that Ken Burns made was about Huey Long. And at the opening section of that documentary, there's some people doing that witness stuff. And there's this nice little demure lady sitting in a brocade chair saying, there wasn't a Saturday that we got together that we didn't try to decide who was going to have to kill Huey. That was my mama. That was my mama talking about their friends in Hammond, Louisiana. That is also an accurate paraphrase, but it was also an accurate period. It was a violent period. So he came to Mississippi in large part because those people behind Percy wanted somebody who was a vigorous, nice, conservative guy who believed in straight government. Didn't know he had any evolving thoughts on race, but which was to manifest itself as time went on.
Let's shift gears just briefly and give Hazel some time here. Hodding, you talked about your dad was an evolving character. From what I know, Dale, Ira Harkey was dead set from day one. He came raring out of Tulane and was ready to fight in Mississippi.
I don't think he can deny it.
Hazel apparently was a evolving character that I understand that she was very much a part of the moderate kind of business establishment in Lexington, and suddenly ran afoul of them. She got is quite indignant over one particular murder and murder that had racial overtones, and it kind of went from there.
Well,
How do you view her
she
well?
comes in as the cutest looking girl from Alabama that ever hit Mississippi press. Came over and gets this little weekly. And she comes down to the Press Association meetings from the late 30s on, and every old goat at the Press Association is chasing her around the table the whole time. And she wasn't married, and she was cute as a hell, and she was smart. And she was also a successful businesswoman on her own. And she had first one and then two weeklies, which were doing extremely well. She had a problem. She had a conscience, and she had a Christian conscience. And I want to emphasize that because she did, and it got her in trouble. Because while she was not prepared to say that we ought to all love our brothers in such a way as to, and I'm talking about in the old days, go to school or anything else, she was also not prepared to accept that a sheriff could shoot somebody in the back and walk away. But before that, just so we remember a lot of times that a lot of highly emotional issues are used to disguise something more close to the bone. What she really opposed was the fact that the racketeers had taken over Holmes County and that the sheriff was one of the guys in the bed with them, and they had gambling and all the rest of this, and she, the Christian, and a person who didn't think that the mob, the Mississippi mob, ought to be running things in Holmes County, attacked them like crazy. It then happened to blend over into the point at which she had to, when that moment to decide came, she had to decide about how she was going to play the increasingly heavy-handed decision by God save us, the business elite of Lexington. Excuse me, all of y'all from Lexington, I never thought there was such a thing as an elite in Lexington for a long time because they were such full of extraordinarily organized hate. But in any case, and she just took them on, and they, of course, a little bit like Daddy taking on Huey Long. It was an unequal battle. I mean, because the people who ran most of the businesses in Lexington and in Durant, which is where her other paper was, were people who believed deeply and fundamentally that the principle of Southern integrity had been that white people did not dissent from what other white people did, and the conformity was required, and they were going to beat it out into her if she had to. And they did a very good job of almost destroying her. After a few years, a woman who reveled in having a new Cadillac about every 2 years, was suddenly running very close to the end of the game in terms of being able to maintain a business. Somewhere in there, Daddy decided that there was probably some things that could be done. So he organized something just absolutely anathema to any legitimate news person in the country, which was to get people to put money into her from outside. And he got a lot of big names in the newspaper business to pump some money in there. And he did himself, though by that time he wasn't in much of a shape to do it either. And she sort of skittered through survival, but not much. And of course, the other boys started, what was it, the Holmes County Herald? Was that the name of it, Jim? Yeah, I think so. Anyway, and it was a Citizen Council deal, and it pretty much got the advertising and all that. Well, the worse she was under attack, the more she attacked. And pretty soon, whatever restraint she had had, or whatever reservation she had had about going all out, she simply just went right down their throat, and the worse off she was, the more she went. And somehow managed to scrape through for quite a long time. Dad had an objective, just so you know something about the Pulitzer Prizes. He was on the Pulitzer Prize committee for some 15 years after he won the Pulitzer Prize. And he knew he was playing with the big boys up there in New York, the ones who met and decided who would win each of the categories. So he, in effect, played the political animal. He would say to the boys from the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Los Angeles Times and the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, I understand you all each believe you ought to win. And I'll be glad to cast my vote for you, for something. But you got to give one Southern editor every year a Pulitzer Prize. And if you go back and look at the period in which Dad was on the Pulitzer Committee, a Southern editor won the Pulitzer Prize every year. every year. Their names sort of cascade in front of me. Buford Boone from over in Tuscaloosa, Hazel, of course. Well, they don't cascade anymore, but my mind doesn't cascade anymore. But you can look it up. It was quite stunning, and he was without one reservation about it, and utterly guileless. He just, because everybody now in the new world of journalistic purity pretends none of this ever happened, but the fact is they were trading off all the time at the Pulitzers and the big boys who were just. And you always had to make sure that St. Louis Post-Dispatch won something, because that's where Pulitzer had been. That was his deal. But you can look it up. All those Southern editors all that time, and Daddy's just sitting there going, bah, 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 bah. Well, a certain kind of Southern editor. He wasn't. Who was here who worked over in Charleston? Anyway, he wasn't going to give it to anybody named Tom Waring from there, and he wasn't going to give it to any Southern editor from Memphis or from New Orleans or some of those other racist scum, but he gave it to all of these wonderful and very brave people in this number of places. He didn't give it. He maneuvered as hard as he could to get it for them, and it did. I used to.
We've always wondered who was responsible for that. Was it Alvin Krebs?
Alvin, of course, is a guy who was up there, had been run out of Mississippi. Does anybody remember the name Alvin Krebs?
Yeah.
He was at Ole Miss. Daddy wrote a number of things about him when he was the editor, who had made the horrible mistake on the Mississippian of calling for the integration of the graduate school. Let everybody get that one right. Not for the total university, but to start the process. And of course, that caught hell.
And he went on to a distinguished career with the New York Times.
And a quite, and in the end, in a very important niche. It always sounds less than it was. He was a chief obituary writer for a very long time, with great grace and very bright and able man. Yeah.
Hazel faced economic boycotts and competition. Dale, your dad basically faced the same thing in Pascagoula, and shortly after he won the Pulitzer, he basically, sold the paper and left town. Did he not?
He did. And I think that was the result of several things. Unfortunately, his marriage to my mom, it fell apart, and they had separated in 1959, he was, living on his own and taking care of those. I mean, we were 6 children. I'm the youngest of the 6 for some reason. And I've always thought, and he always thought, that, the coast was different. It was more like a melting pot of a lot of different cultures on the coast. And it was difficult to sustain some of the racist hatred that you would see in some of the other areas of the state that I've had to read about. I never experienced that because lifelong, native of down there on the beach down. The first thing I recall was that when it happened, the riot here in Mississippi happened, the next thing we learned, or Dad learned, was that the sheriff of Jackson County had actually driven a bus up here, or had someone drive a bus, and had put out a call, and they filled it up with ruffians and goons, as Daddy later called them, brought them up here, and those individuals took part in the riot. And then they went back to Pascagoula and established not necessarily a white citizens council, but the Jackson County Citizens Emergency Unit, and dubbed it, for disaster relief purposes. And they were meeting at the courthouse. This organization was meeting. Now I've been an assistant district attorney, and I've been a district attorney in Jackson, Georgia, and Greene County, my district, and now a judge. And the idea that an organization with the avowed purpose of violence and suppression of the blacks and the Negroes at the time was meeting at the courthouse, the center of the county's justice, so to speak. That's just repugnant to me. At the time, though, it was perfectly acceptable, apparently. And to have the chief law enforcement officer of the county, Jackson County, in charge and in promoting this organization when Dad got wind of it from, certain, anonymous phone calls, and people would call and say, you need to watch out. They're talking about, killing you and doing things. And they were talking about advertising. The White Citizens Council was like the uptown
My
Klan.
dad called the uptown Ku Klux Klan.
Exactly.
Is what he called them. In
They would put
strain.
pressure on, on merchants to not do business, to boycott, to try to get other, raise enough money to get an interest in another newspaper to compete and that type of thing, but always with the threat of force behind it. And Daddy's, suffered a rifle shot through the front door, a shotgun blast through the, he'd already, through his office windows, blew out 4 or 5 windows of his office at the paper. We'd already experienced a cross burning in our yard back after his, reasonable 20-year approach probably to the gradual integration of the schools after Brown versus Board of Education. Thought maybe 20 years would be a good, period of time
For gradual.
for a gradual integration, starting obviously with the graduate schools, because you had more adult people, better educated on both white and black, that would probably be able to deal with integration on it better. There was a cross burn in our home in Pascagoula. Those things were foreign to the coast area. It didn't take up. When he learned what the organization was about, had it infiltrated, was reporting their meetings on the front page of his paper and calling everybody in the county out, because he had turned to just about everyone, and not very many people, anyone would publicly support him.
Your dad wrote a book called The Smell of Burning Crosses. And Jan Witt, who couldn't be with us today, her book is Burning Crosses and Activist Journalism, Hazel, Brannon, Smith, and the Mississippi Civil Rights Movement. Hodding, you have crosses burned on
Yeah,
you?
sure. I mean, yes, but that it was not really the big thing, though. One thing, just to remind you why occasionally I grow intemperate about some of my friends in Washington County. When my brother died in 1964, and the whole thing was cresting into the Freedom Summer, some of our good friends came and burnt a cross on the front lawn as an act of respect for my brother, now dead. But that was fairly consistent. We had been under organized, very successful boycott outside of Greenville from 1959 on, 55 on. Dad had been a friend of the court against the ruling before it came down, saying we needed more time. It was one of those, we need more time, friend of the court kind of deals. 4 days after the 54 decision, he wrote one and said, okay, they've ruled, and now we're going to live with it, and we're going to obey it. And that was not an amusing thing to have said in 54. But as I say, they accepted that. The courthouse thing reminds me of the vast differences, I suppose, between the coast and the Delta, because nobody even thought twice about it. Of course they met in the courthouse. That's where the leadership met. I mean, and it was because they wouldn't say who was coming or wouldn't announce who were the membership of the original thing that Dad first attacked them. As if, gentlemen, I think it went, if you are as honorable as you say you are, tell us who you are and let us know what your program is. Except, of course, to maintain, as I said, the peace and to keep the Ku Klux Klan from seizing control of the reaction. I have a friend here in the audience who, in 1961, furious that Oliver Emmerich had been beat up in Oliver, who was a publisher editor in Macomb Enterprise Journal, got beat up by a bunch of Klansmen because Oliver had suggested that they not go out and kill the Freedom Riders when they showed up. Oliver was no liberal either. And Daddy was up at Brown University giving a talk. And somebody said, well, what should we do about this violence, about the Freedom Riders? And he says, well, got arrested. And they said, well, suppose it can't do it. He says, U.S. Marshals. Suppose that doesn't work. He says, troops, if that's necessary. If we can take on the Soviet Union, we can take on a bunch of thugs in the Deep South. They went crazy. the wonderful citizen leadership of Indianola put out this huge front ad in the paper over there. Is Hodding Carter in step? We, the undersigned, repudiate the remarks of this man who had said, if I were so out of step, why aren't I out of business, is what he had said up there. Whenever he got intemperate, he got really intemperate. But in any case, and it was distributed all over the Delta, and that was another one of those times we lost about 10% of our circulation for a while, because, of course, to be sitting there, and because of that wonderful conjunction and cooperation between the Jackson newspapers and the Citizens Council, the council had helped guide Jimmy Ward, the editor, into a front page story in the Daily News that says, Carter urges force be used to integrate state. That from Dad saying, if we can put down the Soviet, we can put this down. And so that story was the centerpiece of this ad in the paper. Years later, a very well-known businessman from Indianola, running a very well-known enterprise called Lewis Grocer and later other things, had a major fire that wiped out a good part of his storage space. And he came over and asked the city council in Greenville to let him use some of the airbase space we had for this storage and other needs that he had until they rebuilt. Morris Lewis was his name. And Morris and Dad and had been friends over the years, but Morris had signed that ad. Well, he came over because I wrote an editorial and say, we don't do anything with that base that doesn't go through the procedure. A bid, make sure nobody else wants it and all that stuff. Morris came in, sat down and said, Hodding, are you trying to put me out of business? I said, Morris, I don't know about that, but you know something about it. He said, what are you talking about? I always had that thing behind my desk, that great big thing out of the Indianola paper, is Hodding Carter in step. I turned and said, that. And Morris said, Hodding, that's not fair. You know I had to sign that. It was a constant, but we were under boycott from 55 until about 1970, when not even the idiots at the head of the Citizens Council could pretend anymore that one little newspaper in Greenville, Mississippi had anything to do with the oncoming wave of change and the Civil Rights Act and everything.
Yeah, all three of the editors that we're talking about, they had the strong editorial voices during a very rough period in Mississippi. It would maybe start with Brown v. Board of Education in 54, the murder of Emmett Till in 55, et cetera, through the 60s. And they were there during that rough time.
They were.
Speaking out. We've got some time for some observations or questions. Lowry?
I just got to thinking, during these times that these editorials were coming out in both your volumes, did other publications, newspapers across the country pick them up and run those?
There's nothing quite so popular as a Southern liberal somewhere else. And so they always like, and so sure, brave Southern editor, is constantly being picked up and saying, this, that, and the other. I mean, that was sort of par for the course.
Like the Times, New York Times.
Yes. Yeah. No, they made reference.
Dad reveled. It'd be picked up and go somewhere else, and he'd, puff himself up a little bit and, walk around. But he reveled in other editors, other newspapers in the state who were conservative and were racist, right. And, would, well, here we go again. What's going on in Pascagoula? That little communist down there on the beach, that would start, and then Daddy would, respond, and then it'd be a response, and he just
that was more fun.
Loved it. I mean, my dad, if nothing else, could turn phrase and could truly, just in a few words, really, if you weren't strong enough intellectually, it would just destroy you. He could, and he loved it. Yeah. He loved it. So,
Daddy loved that too. That's the thing about it.
I don't know where pugnacious that thing, but he just loved the war he had, and he always called it the war with the press in Mississippi, and it started in 1950 when he addressed them. It was
that was so good. More powder pigeons in the Mississippi Press Association than I ever saw.
Robert, you got a hand.
Couple questions.
say I, who was on the board of the Mississippi Press Association. But anyway, yeah.
The Washington County Supervisors advertised in the DDT or not?
Yes, they did.
Question about Jackson County Supervisors.
Let me tell you a story first. In Louisiana, Huey Long got a law passed which said you had to pass a moral fitness test to be able to carry legal ads. One newspaper in all Louisiana didn't pass the test. It was Daddy's little pissant daily newspaper in Hammond, Louisiana. And they gave the legals, which was among the many reasons he was finally destroyed. But no, we never had it cut out from under us.
And in Jackson County?
For what? I didn't hear the question, I'm sorry.
Legal advertising.
Oh, the legal publications from the county? No, although the boycotts, Daddy only faced 4 months in September of '62, after the riots here, of 4 months of intense boycott, threats, and that type of thing. And there wasn't any other newspaper in the county. So Dad had somewhat of a, posted on the courthouse, wall or something, but no newspaper. Dad also had an ally, it turned out, that others didn't, which was Ingalls Shipyard at the time. It was a federal contractor, federal ships built for the Navy, the federal government under the Kennedy administration. The man that came to Daddy's aid publicly once and essentially just, smothered whatever the fire was starting to burn was Claude Ramsey, who was and Dad was a union man, and Claude Ramsey was the head of the state AFL-CIO. And he said, gentlemen, if we don't help this friend here, and if we have an incident, an ugly racial incident in Jackson County, the federal government, our livelihood depends on these contracts from the government, and they will not invest in this, here. We have to. And since most of the affiliation of the members of this unit, citizens unit in Jackson County, were Ingalls, employees, the word got out, and it just took 4 months. And after that, and Daddy walked around Popinjay thinking he'd won, but nobody would say anything to him. Nobody would talk to him. And winning the Pulitzer, is a horrible disgrace for a Mississippi newsman at this time. And they announced it at the Rotary Club, and he says, not one person clapped. No one said a word. And so that's when he decided he'd had enough, his personal life and else. He found a buyer, sold it for 10 times what he bought it for, and went on to, academic and other pursuits.
I want to say one thing, because neither Hazel nor Ira had something we had.
I have to say this, if I can. Unlike your dad died early and such.
He did.
My dad outlived most of his enemies, which is the best, the best.
I didn't working on it.
I was elected. My family, we stayed in Mississippi. My mother and relatives in New Orleans, and this is our home. I was elected district attorney in 1991. My dad was floored. He never thought, his wildest dream, that any offspring of his would ever achieve anything in the state where he left on such bitter terms. It was his book. You can see, if you read his book, Smell of Burning Cross, it's bitterness, personal and professional, kind of a bitterness about it. But when I was elected, he was like set back. And he wrote a 2-line letter to the editor. I remember, I cut it out and have it now. And to the letter to the editor in the paper, Mississippi Press, and they printed it, and it said, things have turned upside down. I am now known in Pascagoula as Dale Harkey's dad. And boy, talk about Popinjay, I was walking around. But he also, things turned. The Rotary Club invited him to speak, and his reception was, he never thought it would happen. The Kiwanis Club.
I won't mention any names, but there's somebody sitting in here that got me invited to come over and speak to a civic club in Indianola, and I thought either he or I were going to be dead before it was over, and I was wrong, right? I mean, it went all right.
It was like the prophet had, the prodigal son had returned, and the reception, 30 years later, was he never thought that would happen.
Isn't it amazing?
The Silver M he received he was invited to speak to the journalism classes here, and it just I know it just let all the resentment and frustration he'd felt just left, and and it was the reconciliation was complete. It was marvelous to see, and I was glad he was alive to see it.
Let's go back to Hazel just a minute. What ultimately happened to Hazel and the Lexington Advertiser?
Are you asking me now to pretend that I can remember precisely? Let me say something about this. Hazel went off on one of her multiple cruises. She loved life, and she went off on one of her cruises, and she came back with her husband, who was the steward on the cruise ship, Walter Smitty. And Smitty helped her a great deal in those bad days. She finally had somebody there with her. And then...
he lost his job.
Well, he did. As a hospital administrator there in Holmes County. But he, what does it gain you? Something. A bunch of us had started something called Mississippi Action for Progress, which was a Head Start thing statewide, which some folks had tried to get established to replace the more liberal child development group in Mississippi. At any rate, it was a big job. And we made him the director of it for some time. And that was not a bad job. I mean, it actually helped him survive in many, many ways because he had that job. What did happen? The Advertiser?
How long did Hazel
how long?
survive?
Yeah, Hazel, let's see if I would say by 85, she was bankrupt in Jackson Federal Court.
Oh, forgot to say that. She also started the Northside Reporter as an effort to reach over.
Burned down in part, I think.
Yeah.
And I'd say by the late 80s, she was out of business. And people say the roof caved in. It literally caved in at the Advertiser.
Yeah.
And all the records and all the old newspapers were lost at that time.
I'm glad you're here because my problem is from 1980 on, you might as well figure I don't know nothing. Because, I mean, I went off to work for Jimmy, and then the paper got sold in 1980, and I didn't come back. So a lot of things I don't know.
This may be an unfair question, but just to speculate, how your fathers and David would respond to Trump. Lots of layers between
Channel.
Maybe an unfair question, but to speculate how your fathers and Mrs. Smith might respond to his antics.
I'm afraid the only thing that's wrong with the way Daddy would have responded was that he would have out-Trumped Trump. I mean, he just, that's the kind of thing that demagoguery drove him crazy. I mean, as I say, we grew up white Southerners. I mean, saying that you hated somebody because they were segregationists was crazy. But demagoguery. And so I think he would have actually said, thank God for Trump, because he'd given something to write about all the time. Whenever you were in trouble, you just turn and write about Trump. And Ira would have made mincemeat out of it.
I think I know what he thought of George Bush, so it would have been horrible.
You mean the younger George?
I know what he thought of him. It would have been horrible. It's horrible to think of what Daddy would have done.
I regret not having an editorial voice anymore when you ask that question.
Ellen.
I really do.
We talked a lot about how your fathers rebelled in the fight. Did you ever see them do any kind of soul searching or second guessing behind the scenes? Or
Let me be honest about something. Again, when anybody talks about courage or anybody talks about heroes, I assume that you're not talking about a psychopath. I don't know anybody who in the end of the day loves being on the wrong end of a long stick. And Daddy hated it in the sense that the idea of being severed from what he considered to be his natural Southern constituency was not something he adored. But I want to be really clear about this. And look, he was scared a lot. I mean, that was one of the reasons he'd get his gun and go sit outside to prove he wasn't scared. I mean, my brother always says, Daddy, for some reason, when they'd call, and they did call all the time, when they'd call and say, we're coming to get you for something, He said, for reasons best known to Dad's psyche, he'd always say, "Come on and get me, you country son of a bitch." Philip says, "I don't know what he thought he was saying, country son of a bitch." But anyway, and he'd go out with the gun, and he'd sit there, and that was something everybody knew. And in some ways, I think that's one reason why folks didn't come. But he hated it. He hated it.
My dad also. When he got bad, he hired an ex-FBI agent as a bodyguard. Moved out of his apartment, moved into a motel. And there's a story he tells about hiring 2 other law enforcement officials from Biloxi to act as night watchmen at the paper, to watch the paper, make sure nothing happens to it. And he said the first night they came by, reported in to he and Mr. Wilson, I think, and Tom Wilson, I believe was the name of the FBI agent, as his bodyguard, and reported in and said, "Boy, we sure hope nobody's stupid enough to try to take us on. We'll fill them full of holes," kind of thing. He said they left the hotel to go guard the newspaper and apparently kept going on back to Harrison County, and they never heard from them. They checked in with the local law enforcement on the way and kept going.
On the night,
Daddy took it serious, and
sure.
he didn't you it, but you have to.
You had to.
And his familiarity with guns was non-existent. He grew up in a gentrified New Orleans, upbringing, and was in the U.S. Navy, so. He couldn't throw any shells at anybody. But
Daddy had joined the National Guard right after Munich. He wrote an editorial and says this means World War II, and the local National Guard commander saw him on the street. Said, "Well, Hodding, that's really good. You know the Guard is always the first to go." So Daddy went back to the office. He says, all right. And in 38, he joins the Guard right after Munich. And Roosevelt, knowing nobody would notice, activated the Mississippi and Alabama National Guards in 1940. A year and a month before Pearl Harbor. And we were out of there in federal service in one way or another thereafter. Dad, on maneuvers in Camp Blanding, Florida, outside of Jacksonville, ran into palmetto and lost the sight of his eye, the center of his right eye, which meant he was no longer going to be in the field artillery, which is how we ended up in Washington. He was in intelligence and what have you. But the reason I tell you the thing about the eye is he loved to hunt. He was the worst shot when he had 2 eyes. He was scary as hell when he had 1. and he had to shoot off the wrong shoulder to make the right eye work. And people paid money not to be in the blind with him.
Wouldn't want to be down right.
But again, I have to tell you a fact here, because if you don't say this and your name is Hodding Carter, you are posing as something you ain't. That town was full of friends. We had multiple friends in the business community and every other kind of community, and it was not a horrible life. And of course my mother would be impossible for anybody to hate, and she was absolutely indispensable to our existence in many ways, because she was an extraordinary woman, but tough. But it was fine. I was less taken by the place than Daddy and Mother, to be honest, because I come back from the war in Washington, and we get there, and Daddy's won the Pulitzer, and I go to school, and I've been in Silver Spring, Maryland, and Washington for 4 years. I have what is considered in Greenville, Mississippi, a Yankee accent. And I had a name which was not a name you wanted to have on the playground of any school, whether Mississippi or not. And then I had a commie daddy. So I had several years of not being amused by being in Greenville, Mississippi, because the kids would reflect their daddies. But I can't say it often enough. Tom Hederman once said to me there was only one town in Mississippi the Carters could have existed in, and it was Greenville, and I think they were right. He, who I never thought was right about anything, but on that one I think he was right. And we were fortunate as hell. I think they've always said maybe the most fortunate thing was Will Percy didn't live long enough to watch Hodding Carter become a racial moderate, because I don't think Will thought he was bringing one up to Greenville in 1936.
Got time for one more question, Ronzo?
What was the amount of African-American
The reason we existed was, and this is absolutely true, that we had the highest penetration, as we like to say in the news business, of the black community of any newspaper in Mississippi. Now, we were a huge newspaper, right? At our height, we had 15,000 circulation. But we had about 35% of our circulation was black. And that was vital. And you know why? Because by the end of days, when they really had the boycott going good, 2 of the 3 biggest advertisers, Steinmart, Jake Stein was the most, important local, were J.C. Penney and Sears. Guess how they make their advertising decisions? Their advertising agencies up in Cincinnati or somewhere else look at penetration. That's all they give a damn about. They don't care about your editorial views. They don't care about anything. They want to know, is this buy worth anything to you? And because they couldn't boycott us out of Greenville, which was important, they never deserted us, and that was also important. But to answer the question, that black readership was indispensable. And of course, we did cover that community on. Daddy started that business in the late 30s, first time he got into a fight at Greenville. He ran Jesse Owens' picture in the paper when he won the damn thing, or when he was being honored, I can't remember which. And of course, people went absolutely berserk, because you didn't run black people's pictures in the newspaper unless they were lynched, period. Go look it up. And he ran that picture back then, and that was where he began to announce that perhaps there was an evolution going on.
Dale, you didn't have as big a black constituency in Jackson County as you would have in Washington County, but you mentioned Ingalls and Claude Ramsey. Your dad, was he helped by labor support?
Absolutely. And that's one of the reasons Claude Ramsey, I always think, I'm always a conspiracist. I'm thinking that the powers that be at Ingalls, probably talk to Claude and say, Claude, you do this, instead of having them to have to step out. Now, nobody in the community, whether it be preachers or businessmen or anyone else, came to Daddy's aid at that time. But Ingalls management was working on it. They kept telling him. And then Claude comes out. And I've always kind of thought, perhaps they just went to Claude and said, Claude, you do this. But Daddy was a liberal. There's no doubt about it. He hit the ground running. He was a liberal. He's a card-carrying member of the ACLU and was proud of it. And he backed, labor, wholeheartedly. And that's part of why Mr. Ramsey came, stepped out. I firmly believe that. But I have no idea what the penetration was. I didn't know that was a journalistic term, actually.
Well, I didn't know it was in the other kind of term for a long time. That ain't what we said in the Delta.
On that note, maybe we better wind it up before it gets really ronky. But anyway, thank you all for coming. Thank you, gentlemen, for remembering.
I enjoyed that, buddy.